So, welcome back. We have now two panel discussions where we're more focusing on questions regarding how to implement and realize inclusive education. My name is Johana Berglein. I'm the Manager of International Affairs for the YAI network. We just had one of our self-advocates speak, which we were very proud of, Janice McPhillips. And YAI has a mission to create opportunities for living, loving, working, and learning for people with intellectual disabilities in the New York metropolitan area. We are one of the largest service providers, and we internationally create opportunities to create services for people with intellectual disabilities that are inclusive in the community. So we work with organizations and governments to achieve that goal, and we're glad to be here and support World Down Syndrome Day. It's a pleasure. So we have 5 questions that I'm going to be posing to the panel. All the speakers have been introduced. I just wanted to point out how international our panel is. So we have Jillian from Down Syndrome Association from the UK. We have Ignacio back from the University of Malaga in Spain. We have Penny Robertson from Down Syndrome International, and who also is the CEO of the Australian International Schools in Jakarta and Bali in Indonesia, and she's from Australia. We have Lanier Santos back from Brazil, and Sue Swenson, who you heard recently from Inclusion International, and who's speaking also on behalf of the United States. And so I would like to pose the first question to the panel, which is, since you have been working in the field, what progress have you seen in the promotion and implementation of inclusive education? Please take initiative, and we have some panelists on the side that can also take initiative to speak. Anybody would like to? Yes, Penny? Yeah.
The question was, since you've been working in the field, what progress have you seen in the promotion and implementation of inclusive education? I've been working in Asia, I guess for the last 37 years, and I have to say that Asia, Southeast Asia anyway, has come an incredible distance in that time, from absolutely almost zero inclusion to some very good examples across a lot of Southeast Asia. There's now a special education teachers association which has conferences every year and promotes best practice. They even give out awards for best practice annually. And I think and most of them teachers that come don't necessarily have to be special education teachers. You get principals attending the conferences, and you get everyone ranging from, we've certainly sent support teachers along to the conferences, and I think that's one of the areas where we really do need to pay tribute to the special education teachers for actually having this organisation which really is now supporting each other in terms of getting more inclusive education practices in schools throughout Asia. Have we got a long way to go? We've got a tremendous journey to undertake because, as everybody's heard today, you can be very good in theory, but having it actually work in practice is not all that easier because there are so many barriers. And as Sue mentioned earlier, behaviour is the most constant excuse for expelling or suspending a student. And it really is no excuse at all because you are not teaching subjects, you are teaching students. And therefore, if a student's not learning, then the teachers need to change the way in which they are teaching. It's not that the student needs to change the way in which they're learning. It's the fact that teachers need to modify their learning. And once you get that message across to teachers and you demonstrate to them how that can happen, then you will find teachers are very much good people and they will actually implement that, those processes. But the other most important thing, I think, in terms of having this change happen is good professional development. And we would do that in our schools every year with every new teacher that comes into the school. And I think it's, the conferences like the Southeast Asian Special Needs Forum, where it's a 2-day conference and people go and everybody has to deliver a status of what's happening in their country, and they learn from one another. These are the things that are going to help inclusive practices spread throughout the country and throughout the region. So have we come a long way in 35 years? I've got to say yes, because I look back and it was one hell of a fight to get my daughter into a school. Well, yeah, I had to set up the school to get her in. But secondly, have we got a long way to go? We've got a tremendously long journey in front of us, and it's up to every one of us that's here to take the fight back to our countries, to our local schools, to our politicians particularly. And then you ask the politicians, why are we not following what is the accepted CRPD policy, particularly if your country has signed it? Because these are the questions they have to come back and answer to you. And it's the point I made earlier. We really have to keep every level accountable. And within schools, you need to keep every level accountable. You cannot have a classroom teacher saying, I can't manage that child, and using that as an excuse to exclude the child. So I've had my say. Over to you.
Sí. Bueno, yo querría comentar.
I wanted to comment, starting from a study that took place. We made a report of our American Down Syndrome organization that has received all the data that we have contributed with organizations on Down syndrome from 12 countries. We have identified 3 major breakthroughs. One is the fight of the families and the results. We have seen progress made in each one of those countries for an inclusive environment. Also, we have made progress in how organizations are gradually going from being organizations that provide resources to become organizations that are now attempting to transform public policies. In my view, that is a large step forward. But in any event, in this area, I would like to add that in Spain, we're living this very clearly. It is necessary for organizations to undertake and embrace the conflict, that understand that there has to be a conflict so that you can really have a transformation in educational systems. In Spain in particular, there was a report, SORCAM as an association that presented a report to the Committee for People with Disabilities. This was to the educational system in Spain because they were systematically violating the rights of people with disabilities. The committee last year issued a report that was very straightforward, and the administration now responding the best way they can. At present, there's a big movement against the rights that we have earned. There's a counter movement from the political stance, also private agencies that are with the interest that are protesting, because we see now the possibility for schools to become inclusive. Another advance we have achieved is international legislation. It is seen by the different countries as an important place for leverage in particular the convention, the CRPD. Also the creation of examples from organizations and schools that are working and that are a role model for other organizations to try to learn from them. That is another idea that I wanted to share.
The great advances that we have in Brazil started in 2000, in the year 2000. In 2008, we had a considerable advance, which was the design and approval of a public policy, which was of an inclusive school with the creation of the specialized support for people with intellectual disabilities within the mainstream schools. All of this came precisely from the effort and will from all families who wanted their children in mainstream schools and not in special education schools, and the entities that in Brazil are formed by the families. So these entities followed as well this path of this will to have their children in mainstream schools. What happened in Brazil was that the practices in schools did not follow the families' desires and the wills of the entities, nor the policies determined. And due to this discrepancy between what was stipulated by the norms and what was happening in reality, a year ago, the Brazilian government decided in the education area to do a reevaluation of this political decision, but did not attempt to do it listening to the families, listening to the society, or the main actors. This generated great confusion that ended in the public ministry in Brazil against this reevaluation that did not listen to the main actors from society interested in this inclusive school. So at the moment, we are in a political vacuum because we do not have the reevaluation of this policy, nor do we have the implementation of the policy. The policy is suspended. Nor do we have the designation of a new person in charge for this area. We have a new government since 2019, and so we have a suspension of all policies and advances that, even with all the challenges they would be normal to have, we would have to come from special schools for inclusive schools, but the advances to make these advances to identify where the obstacles are and to overcome them so the political could advance, we are in a great risk of retrocess. If we go backwards, we will also be leaving people behind.
I've been working in the field a long time, so I certainly have seen huge changes in inclusive education in the UK in that time. Tremendous changes. And it feels like they happened fairly quickly once it all started to move. In primary school, it moved quickly. And, you know, for quite a long time, it has been that, you know, children go to primary schools, and teachers do realise that is their job to do that. More of them do. Where it gets, and you know, we have many lovely, well, just so many wonderful examples, and lots of positivity. Except what I talked about this morning about those people with more complex needs, very complex needs, where that isn't quite the case. Where it's been patchy and more difficult has been with secondary education. And what happened there is we have some regions and some areas who were probably the first ones to move on inclusion, and they became well established. And then we have other regions, other local authorities, other cities where secondaries never really become firmly established secondary inclusion, and it still isn't now. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to make a couple of quick notes. I think that since I started working when my son was born in 1982, I think physicians overall have become more aware of how the impact of their words on families of children with disabilities. There are bad examples, but there are also many good examples. Teacher training is on the upswing, or the focus on teacher training, the effort to fund it on a broader level is very important. Post-secondary education, we have developed more and more real inclusive options. So we started out and it looked like it was going to be a day program delivered on a college campus, and now it's much more focused on what is the curriculum in the college. Early education, interestingly enough, when the ADA passed, the first lawsuit that was brought was about access to childcare for children with disabilities. And it was, interestingly, part of the parents' right to have childcare for their child with a disability. So there seemed to be a more holistic look at families that I'm hoping will still develop. I think parents now are almost wobblier. I just explained the Google thing. That's out there. Young people are our biggest allies. So youth now have a strong cultural commitment to diversity, and it includes disability. They don't really want to think about being in schools that don't have kids with disabilities in them, and I'm hoping we can harness that and help use it to help us move forward. I do also want to say that in the Obama administration, Melody Musgrove, who was the Office of Special Education Programs Director, she's now professor at the University of Mississippi, made the largest ever grant that our office had ever made. And it was $25 million to promote the inclusion of children with disabilities, poor children, and children who were learning English as a new language. And to bring those things together. It was a very successful grant program. You can find it online under Swift Schools, SWIFT.
Thank you. Do we have any comments from the side, panelists?
I just want to compliment what Lenir said about... Let's see. Is it better? You need it for the translators. Oh, of course. Thank you. So in Brazil, this national policy that we have, which last year completed 10 years, generated a very significant transformation in our statistics. Just for you to have an idea, 10 years ago, when you take a look at the enrollments in basic education, from the amount of enrollments that were occupied by students with disabilities, only 35% represented inclusive environments. So the rest of the students were in segregated environments. 10 years later, when you take a look on those statistics, now we have 90% of the students with disabilities in inclusive environments, and only 10% in segregated settings. So this illustrates the power of a strong public policy. Even with the risk that we are facing of having setbacks in this policy, I don't see another way of changing the system without a strong public policy. So that's it, Lenir.
Thank you very much. Yes, and the lady, yeah.
I wanted to also mention something that hasn't been, maybe it's only like common in some countries, and it's the community. In addition to maybe the training and the school policies and the government policies and all this, I think what we're facing, like particularly in Lebanon, is that there's a lot of ignorance among the community itself, which hinders a lot of the trying to make inclusion work, because many people are scared, or they have these misconceptions about having their children in schools where there are children with special needs in the same school. This, at the same time, is also backfiring the parents of the people who have special needs, because they're also afraid to put their children in environments that could cause a lot of bullying or being rejected by the community. So even if the system was great and wonderful, but the students, if they are placed in these communities or in schools where there's community rejection, it's becoming very difficult to achieve success. So we feel that we need to work so much on the public awareness of people before. It's important that we hope that our governments would take a stand towards public awareness. So we're working a lot on trying to create advocacy among the public, that our children are just like any other child, and they have the right to be part of the community. And this, I think, is a huge factor that could impact inclusion. Another issue I wanted to stress is the idea that we're always committed to curriculum, to outputs, and to following the certain standards in education. I think education is basically that we need to teach anybody the skills to be able to live their life independently and in a productive way. So we may need to really somehow throw out all these restrictions on the curriculum and other things, and just figure out what is really important for any individual to live a decent, normal life and be productive. And that's, I think, the essence of the whole thing. It's really not related neither to curriculum nor to anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really about including everyone. So thank you. Yeah, one more? Okay.
If I could make a comment, just picking up from Hanna's point. I think it's really important that we talk about, barriers, and we're sort of, in discussing moving forward and how far we have to go, I think we also have to acknowledge some very significant setbacks in a lot of parts of the world, countries like Australia being an example, where there's actually been significant regression. And so in Australia, we have data that suggests that segregation has actually grown over the last decade or so, and look at those factors. And I think when we talk about systemic change, we also do need to talk about parents and look at these factors, which I guess they result in parents also advocating for more segregation. And what underpins that? So some of it, obviously, it's around expectations in education. I guess ableism, if we were to refer to just the set of cultural beliefs that we as parents bring to the role. But also, I think the very poor implementation of inclusive education in many places has resulted in people reaching a conclusion that inclusion didn't work for my child, or inclusion has failed, or inclusion isn't for everybody. That's why I think general comment number 4 is very important, because it sets out the clear definition so that we can identify that a lot of what we have been doing has been integration rather than inclusion, and to ensure that policy reflects that. Because if you look at the example of Australia, policy has not really been particularly successful in moving us forward towards a fully inclusive education system.
Thank you for bringing up all the successes and answering the second questions regarding the barriers. Work was kind of naturally followed as well and included. So thank you very much, and we can see that cooperation is very important, and that governments and legislation and the implementation is really crucial. And there is sometimes a feeling of fear of setbacks, of accomplishments that we had, and really the change always being driven by the need, by the families, by the parents, but also the struggle to change mindsets and how we can move forward. So I want to focus on one more question that might be really crucial for us to discuss on how change is really, positive change is really happening. So in your experience, has the implementation of inclusive education occurred as a result of policy change, or has it occurred mainly due to localized stakeholder activity?
In my experience, it occurs as a result of all of those factors. Not any single factor will bring about that change. And I think we only have to look at what the EU has recently done in terms of redefining what inclusion means. And I think that's a great threat to an incredible number of people living in the EU, but it's also challenging the UN and the UNCRPD. And I think they have to be brought to account to actually stand up and say, you know, what the real reason is behind redefining what inclusion is, because it isn't what they are trying to now define it as. And can I just go back to the barriers? Because basically, parents, when they enroll their child in a school and expect inclusion to happen, really come to you with very great fears that their child might be bullied, that their child won't get the support, that their child will be isolated, all of these things. And what they need around them is a support structure. And it's one of the things that we found works really well, is that if you actually have a buddy system in the classroom and in the playground and in the library and everywhere else, that's how you develop empathy in other students. And we've had examples where parents have come in and not told us that the child has a special needs because they've had such terrible experiences somewhere and they're scared that you're going to exclude the child. Well, that doesn't help either, because in actual fact, if you don't know what the challenges are that that child is facing, you can't address them and put them in the IEP program right from the beginning. And the important thing about teaching is that you are teaching individuals. Every child is different in your classroom. Some kids are extremely good at maths. Some kids are absolutely find maths a challenge. And when you think about your education, you would probably decide where the subjects you liked better. And they're probably ones that came easier to you or that you had an interest in. So why should we define a student with disabilities by their disability when we don't define other students in the classroom by their lack of ability in a subject area? So it gets back to what I said in the beginning. You are teaching individuals, and therefore what we're moving towards in terms of good education, best practice, is that every child should have an individualised education program. Every child in the classroom. You should know, you should have enough support in that classroom so that every child actually gets the support they need, whether they have special needs, language difficulty, problems at home. All of those things affect every child that's in your class. And just very quickly, somebody mentioned the problem with secondary schools. Yes, I totally agree. While it probably only took us 5 or 6 years to get a primary school that I felt was totally, well, not totally, but getting there, becoming very inclusive, the high school must have taken double that time, because high school teachers are trained that they are teaching a subject. They are science teachers or they are maths teachers or whatever it is, and they've not been educated or had the professional development training that teaches them that they are teaching individuals. And that whole turnaround in education has to happen at their training, when they're getting their training levels. So I think that and the fear that teachers have that they will be left with a student sitting up the back that they can ignore, or they have to ignore because they have so much work to get through, is a very real fear. So not putting in supports in the classroom to ensure that every child is adequately enabled in that classroom is not inclusion. You cannot do it on a mere string budget. And I think that's what's happening in Australia and happening in a lot of other areas where they are not actually putting in the support basis. They are finding other reasons to spend their money on, in Australia's case, stadiums. But it gets back to what are your priorities. And the biggest investment you can make in any country is in the education of its children. And if you educate all children to a high standard, then the GDP, the level of progress that country make will be very measurable. And I've seen it in Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia, 20 years ago didn't know what a child with disability was. We would get stopped in the street and asked, about Down syndrome because people had never seen it before. They knew somebody that was, in a house that had a child like that or something. So, it's that education factor is just so important. And the education factor I'm talking about here is also what you call awareness. And therefore, every organisation has a responsibility to not just advocate for people with Down syndrome or for good education, but to actually ensure that their community becomes aware of what people with disabilities challenges are and what they need. And what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, is that we've gone from 22 years ago where I had to tell parents that their kids would not suffer by having a child with special needs in the class, to parents now knowing that they were coming into the school because the school had students with special needs in it. So that's one change that we've seen in 35 years. And thank goodness. But, it's still a long way to go.
Thank you.
And I'd go back to challenging the EU and challenging the governments who are not following the UNCRPD. Thank you.
And the question of whether public policy or individual action is the driver, you must have both, as Penny said. It's critically important, and as other speakers have said. But I think there's one interesting little flip in there, and that is when you have public policy that's very strong, parents can sometimes think that their job is to demand compliance with the law. And demanding compliance with the law is always a mistake, because compliance is the least that has to be done. And the law can really only describe that. So you can't go below this level, but you have to do this level. We really want to aim much higher than that. And when you go into a school system and demand compliance, it is naturally a very unattractive position to take. Teachers don't like to be told, here's the cookbook, just follow it, shut up, and just do what I told you to do. It's really not the kind of activity or the kind of advocacy that's going to draw people's best thinking in. So we really want to move, I think, special education to a place where schools and parents will be trying to invent what is the most we can do, not just what is the least we can do.
Thank you, Sue. Ignacio?
Sí.
Yes, as far as what Sue was mentioning, my understanding is that evidently to require compliance doesn't meet the needs of what we're talking about, because although a teacher is forced for someone to be there, that doesn't mean that that person will be duly assisted. But also, while I was listening to this, I was thinking, and what less than demand compliance? I mean, it's the minimum, because if we compare that to other fields, compliance must be there. While I was listening to you, you were talking about accountability. This is, to a great extent, to demand compliance. In Spain, some families, in fact, have demanded compliance to as far as going to the court to demand compliance of inclusive rights of their children. And these people have done more for advocating inclusive education in our country compared to many people from the academia and many politicians, just by the mere fact of having confronted the practices that the schools were enforcing, not just practices, but also the middle-of-the-road rules that are against the convention. And these are the ones that are ruling the culture and the policies in schools. These are the middle-of-the-road rules that need to be changed. Also, of course, the rules by themselves will not solve the issue. Daniela was mentioning before that whatever is in writing is enough. In a program to advocate inclusive education in the Americas that we are developing with Professor Melansko and other distinguished activists, one of the things that we are finding out in Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, is that regulations are changing. Regulations are changing, but reality is not changing. How can we really implement a transformation of this reality? This is the big question. In my view, right now, we are experiencing, and I don't believe that this is a crucial moment just in my country. I've seen this in other countries in Latin America. I believe that right now we are going through a weak global period. Brazil is a case in point. This is a moment in which we are going backwards in the accomplishments that we had, and these accomplishments were not really much to boast about, but these have been ephemeral because what we're seeing is that it's easy to go backwards. As far as the barriers diagnosed, just 3 points. In this report by the Ibero-American Federation of Down Syndrome, we find, number one, these behavioral barriers, and specifically behavior barriers, we may transform them with knowledge because there is lack of knowledge and fear. But no, you cannot solve this just with knowledge. In fact, right now, when we're going backwards as far as public policies, what we're witnessing is that there's lack of willingness, lack of will. Just like what Sue was pointing out, she's absolutely right. There needs to be a will. We also talked about biases and paradigms barriers. We still are struggling to tear down these segregation barriers, and also the need to transform the intermediate legislation that goes from the convention to the classroom. What happens in the middle? That's conforming the practices, basically that.
Follow Ignacio's comment, and it follows on from Sue as well. In my view, it's important to have the policy in place, and it's important to have the supports of that, but that's a necessary condition, but not sufficient in a mathematics sense. You know, that because we have evidence from the research that I've been doing of people in virtually the same environment, their schools in the same context, just a suburb away, and you will have inclusive practice a disaster, and in another place the same child moves from one school to another and it goes swimmingly. Now, it's not the child who's changed or at fault, and behaviour can be an issue certainly, but it's what is the response to that behaviour. So the child that is in my mind was exhibiting some pretty difficult behaviours, which was ending up in the exclusion. But then she goes to another school without any change. But what was changed was the attitudes of the people. And it was their imagination and their willingness to just give it a red-hot go, as we say in Australia. They were just going to not worry about all the baggage that the other school was trying to tell them. They were just saying, this is the way we are. We expect that we will be able to teach this child. And I think it was 3 weeks before that child really just settled in, only 3 weeks. And the only place that she didn't go terribly well to was the library. And it turned out in her previous school, that's where she'd been excluded. So when things weren't going on in the classroom, they'd dump her in the library with somebody. And so for me, it's important to have the legislation. It's important to have the policy. And that was there in spades in that schooling system. But you've got to have the imagination in the teachers. And when you've got people with that will to do it, it just flows. And so I think we need to have all of those things working together.
Thank you. Julian wanted to?
Actually, I have nothing to add to the other brilliant speakers. I agree with all of you. I probably could take it back to, I think, what Sue said this morning. Apologies if it wasn't Sue, about what is education all about. Taking it back to that. What is it about, who's it for, and the bigger picture. That's it. Okay.
Thank you, Lanier.
Bem, eu entendo que é necessário. São 3 coisas.
I understand that there are 3 relevant things: policy, the will and the awareness of the families, and also training of teachers and their interest. This is a tripod, like a bench. When you take one leg out, the bench is not stable. That's what happened in Brazil as well. In the 1980s, families started to get together and creating associations to try to change schools, because schools did not accept people with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities. So there was a strong movement in the 1980s, which found in the government in the 2000s the willingness to open that debate and make changes. Rodrigo showed that there was a growth in registrations in mainstream schools. So we do need to have the public policy, the will of the families and society, and also training and interest on the part of teachers.
Thank you, Lanier. Thank you for the lively discussion. Yeah.
Sí, solo apostillar algo más.
Yes, just to make another comment. As far as this presence of will, which in my view is very important, it's necessary to have the will from the educator, from the teacher, but you need to start from a principle. We're talking about the infringement of a human right, violation of human rights. If we're talking about human rights violation, this cannot be left only placed in the hands of will, of the presence of will. On one hand, we have a necessary condition, and then we need to follow up on that. Just to give you an example, this year, training new future high school teachers. This case was math, physics, chemistry. And a student approaches me and tells me, I understand what you're saying about people with disabilities. I get it. But that doesn't sits well with me. And I tell him, well, then you have the wrong job. If you don't like this, that means that you have the wrong job. So we must say this. And from this thought, that we need to demand that a violation of a fundamental human right cannot stand, then from that point on, we need to provide the resources in order to have a transformation. Now, you have the obligation to provide assistance, and public policies must must demand from teachers to carry out this function. How do you force them? Not just with penalties, but also with training. But we must force them.
Thank you. Thank you for answering the question and the emphasis not only on legislation, but the implementation, the importance of making it happen in regards to working with the professionals and giving them the opportunity to do their job well and play their part. We will be moving on to the second half of the panel due to time constraints. And I just wanted to say really quick, I know we're all here for a common goal that means inclusive education. If we want to create inclusive societies, inclusive education is a key. And if we have one generation in inclusive education, we will have a generation that sees inclusiveness as a norm and expects an inclusive society. So this is a really important goal, and thank you for the organizers to putting this together and to bringing these people from all over the world together. And this needs to be a starting point to connect also with the people who are listening online, to connect and bring the different experiences together to learn from each other. So please take initiative and use this forum to work together going forward. And I'm going to hand over to our colleague Katja to continue the moderation of the second half.
So the next session that we have, we're going to be talking about more broadly the future of inclusive education. So we're a little bit pushed for time, so we might not look at all the questions, but I wanted to start then picking up on some of the discussion from this previous panel, and in particular we've now mentioned stakeholders. So in terms of stakeholders working together, I guess it's a question that I think possibly has two parts. So who are the stakeholders? So who are the stakeholders in this sort of, I guess, effort to advance inclusive education? And how can we work together to advance inclusive education, including in terms of providing a strong evidence basis so that we can really push the system to implementing this, fundamental human right? So perhaps if we could start with you, Rodrigo. With
okay. Is it on? Thank you, Katja. During our research efforts, we created a framework which considers 5 stakeholders dimension. So the public policy makers is the first one. The second stakeholders are the school's manager or principals, so the leaders of the schools. The third group are the parents, the families related to children with disabilities or children excluded. Then we have the organizations from the civil society that can contribute with the schools. And then we have the teachers. So of course, this is just a framework. It's not perfect, but it helps us to avoid forgetting the fundamental stakeholders that needed to be considered.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Actually, you had a list right there, which is really useful. Danielle, if I could turn to you, and with that list of stakeholders in mind, perhaps also ask whether you think that there are others that we should consider. And I think in particular, earlier today we also talked a bit about including students, so the role of students and student voice in this effort as well. So if I could turn to you
Sure.
on this question.
I would like to do my intervention in Spanish this time, so I'm turning the language. Thank you. Pienso que además, Rodrigo...
I believe Rodrigo has mentioned perfectly well what I believe are the stakeholders. I would mention we have been working with all the consultations. We have been working with stakeholders and those who train the teachers. I believe those are the key agents because they're just in time to include this new approach that we need should be included in schools since our understanding of really meeting the diversity of the class. I would also give professionals who develop teachers and train teachers and students themselves, their voice actually is the one that should matter the most when we are trying to develop policies and to execute actions for inclusive education. As far as the second question that you asked, Kathy, I believe that in spite of some of the research that are being carried out at present, there's a lack of information that really analyzes in depth the way our educational system is really working in every country and globally as well. We need to ask ourselves what is working, what is not working, and what else is there. One of our guests always asks us this, and it's really very important so that we can find the course of action. Very important to start articulating efforts to gather not only evidence, but also statistics and qualitative information of what works and what does not work in the educational system to be able to shape technical proposals for the governments to implement. I had the opportunity to work for some years in the education ministry in my country, and I believe that there's so many obstacles that from the civil society are hard to understand. It's not easy to execute actions from the government, but there's also a lack of quality on what should be prioritized in the resources available in each country. In our role as family members, as professionals, as representatives of civil society, we should pronounce all the proposals for the government, and that should be done in collaboration amongst all of us.
It was great. And if I could turn to Hanna in relation to that question, whether you have something to add to what the previous speakers have mentioned.
In principle, no, I don't think I have a lot to add, except that I wish we could say the same thing about the situation. As I said, in our country, the government is not on our side at all so far. We are actually facing a lot of resistance, and I wish that that could change and they can become the primary policy makers for the inclusive education. So until now, the stakeholders are the organizations, the NGOs, the principals of the schools who are committed, and mostly they are private schools, not the public sector. Unfortunately, we can't do a lot in the public sector. The principals have played a big role in the advancement of inclusive educations in the schools who have decided to adopt this principle. Of course, the training of the teachers, as has been mentioned, is of great importance, and again, the community. If the community is accepting, we can rise up and do a lot. And in our experience on the private level, this is what we're hoping for, that we can create these models, and hopefully then we will be able to convince the government that this works. So we are really at a very critical stage now. We cannot avoid to fail. We cannot afford to fail. We have to be very careful in how we are implementing this and trying to learn from all the experiences that is happening all around the world so that we can avoid the pitfalls that others have had, so we can become really more or less, as I said, to set an example that can be later on adopted by the government. So ideally, yes, I do hope that one day we will be proud to say that our government has started to implement these policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. And Rhonda, if I could turn to you and perhaps in particular maybe give some thought when we look at that list of stakeholders and the stakeholders that have been mentioned, whether there are particular stakeholders that we need to work harder at working with and bringing along, with everyone else on the journey.
I think it's a really important point to consider the people who are left out. And some of the people left out, well, definitely we rarely hear the student voice. And I think more and more we're encouraged to listen to students, but actually how we go about doing that, particularly with students who are non-verbal or find articulating their views difficult when they're in an intimidating situation, is a challenge that we need to consider. But beyond that, the groups that I get particularly concerned about are the parents who themselves feel uncomfortable in schooling. So for people like me who had a successful time at school, who enjoyed it, I couldn't really imagine that school wouldn't be a place that was an enjoyable place to be until my daughter was at the butt of discrimination and downright appalling practice that we could have taken to law for her school. And I, for the first time, realised how awful schools can be and how confronting it can be. And so when we have families who find it so threatening to be involved in inclusive education conversations, don't know what it's about, don't know how to do it, don't know how to advocate, how do we hear their voice? How do we help them to be in this conversation and to realise that they do have that power to be able to speak and be involved? And I think that's why in our country we're getting this pushback, because special schools tend to promote themselves as a place where they welcome everybody. And when you've been fighting and people have been criticising your child and you're in trouble all the time, the very thought that you might actually go to somewhere where they're not going to do that to you, it becomes comforting. And I think they're the sorts of stakeholders that we need to be able to address and help to get into the conversation.
I think it can perhaps lead us into the next question. So we've talked about stakeholders. I think earlier there was a discussion about countries being at different stages, and we've also talked about the human rights framework. So bringing that together, we now have a document issued by the CRPD committee, which is General Comment 4, which defines inclusive education and which really provides a bit of a blueprint for going forward. So now perhaps we have something that we can all reference or refer to and make sure that we're all swimming in the same direction, because I think one of the things when you look at this implementation of inclusive education historically and across systems, there has been a lot of confusion. So now we've got, a bit of clarity. We know who our stakeholders are. So to the next question, what I'd like to ask the panellists, starting again with Rodrigo, what do you think the future is for inclusive education and how can we shape that future?
Okay, Katja. Well, one of the things that we have discussing in our organization is what will be the role of the specialists in the future. So I like the idea that Penny mentioned, that each student should have an individualized planning approach. Any student, regardless of having a disability or having some kind of disorder. In that sense, part of our dream when we think about the school of the future, the inclusive school, is that teachers, they need more time for planning. At least in our country, they have to teach 2 terms per day, so that the routine is very tough, and the time reserved for planning is very small. So I think one of the assumptions is to really dedicate time thinking about each student and in a collective way, planning with their colleagues, involving the whole pedagogical team, so that we don't need specialists anymore, because the specialist has a very important role in the sense of how they can add their expertise and the knowledge they bring. But it's interesting to think how the teachers of the common classroom can themselves create alternatives and test and assume the risk of experimenting new strategies and together thinking of how to move on with each student. So that's what we dream in terms of considering that the term inclusive should be like a pleonasm for quality education.
Thank you. And if I could turn to you, Daniela, and also the other members of the previous panel, if you would like to add, please indicate, raise your hand, and I'll move over to you as well in the course of the discussion.
Thank you, Katia. Yo voy a recoger un poco algo que hemos conversado.
I'm going to gather what I have heard that has been discussed here today, that it should have a broad approach of what inclusion should be. I truly believe that if we think of the future of inclusive education in a broader sense, thinking of diversity, including every student, those learners that also have disabilities, but not only them, I believe that it would be a very positive future. That's my view in this regard. I truly believe, and it becomes more obvious, that society is developing a need to assess and have respect for the different differences of some groups that are raising their voices and that in the past were excluded. This movement we see occurring now should be transferred to the schools, that the classroom could really become spaces where everyone feels embraced, welcome, and everyone with high expectations, especially the students for themselves. With this new gaze, I think education would be the only vehicle to ensure quality education for all. If we see it this way, inclusive education would become the way of being for the school, not just a strategy to include a specific group. It involves a huge transformation that has to stem from the school itself, but it would ensure not only for inclusion to occur, but to become the language spoken every day in every school. If we should head in this direction, articulating this with every group that is working to include education for all.
I thought about the aspect of teacher training, and for our this vision I shared, for that to be feasible, we have to invest more in the basic education of the teachers, because in our country, they normally start studying inclusive education after they are already at the classrooms. The university, they don't offer this discipline, or this is not an issue, you know. So maybe we should dedicate more effort in trying to guarantee that all colleges, all undergraduate courses, and all universities, that they have this discipline obligated to any person that will teach. Otherwise, it's just words, yeah.
If I could add to that as well, I think the post-training or the post-university ongoing development is really important as well, because, I mean, that's another area where sometimes teachers do receive, appropriate training, and obviously university degrees for a finite amount of time, but you then sort of get into the system and there is a particular way of doing things or a school, and that can be lost. So I think the ongoing training is also critical. Penny, did you want to add something?
Well,
to
I would
that?
just add that professional development within the school is extremely important, and it has to become a big focus on all schools to actually allocate funds for that to happen, because that's where you get the change in practice in the classroom. My last message, I hope, to you all would be, don't give up. And if you see parents needing the support, get them the support. Either you find someone who can go in and be an advocate with them, because there's nothing more threatening to a parent to have to go in and defend the behaviour of their child, sitting around a table with another 6 professionals who are all there, who are going to tell you how horrible your child has been. So don't allow any parent to go in alone. Make sure they have that advocacy support group, and don't give up. We're getting there. It's just taken time.
To make. If I could then move to Hanna, if you have something to add to the question, that'd be great.
Sure. To me, the future of inclusive education we would be successful when we don't use the word inclusion anymore. Education is just that. It's education, and I feel that it's the UDL maybe is one way where we would be able to reach everybody, where we would be able to respond to the students' needs and work towards, like, what do the students want? How can we reach? What's education? Where are we going? Why are we teaching our children? I mean, there must be a purpose. If we do understand that, if we start responding to their needs, if we start responding to what they like to do, what they want, how they learn, how to, so that we know how to teach them. When we put resources in front of them and allow them to discover their way and know how to learn. I mean, we are the facilitators. We are no more the people who are dictating things. We need to work towards making them expert learners, to learn by themselves, to find their way. So I think we really need to maybe review the whole concept of what is education. And once we start removing all these barriers, I may have some extremist views. Sometimes I even believe an IEP is a barrier, and I think it really takes a lot of time of things that we could do, to improve maybe in the education, instead of spending all this time on just trying to create the perfect IEP. But anyway, that I hope it works.
Hanna, I think a few people would agree with that statement about IEPs. Rondo, if I could have your last comment on this question. Thank you.
Thanks. I work in teacher education. And one of the things that we hear all the time, and lots of studies all over the world say that teachers graduate feeling unprepared. And I think the mistake is then made, well, we've got to do something to fix up those pre-service courses. What I think we should be recognising is that in anything we do, like getting a driver's licence, that's just the start. So it's not what we do to get people graduating. It's then what do we do afterwards? And taking an example of having a student with Down syndrome in your class, in an Australian school, that's actually not all that common in someone's career. So they might teach a student with Down syndrome once in their career and never again. You could be like me and teach for 15 years and never teach a child with Down syndrome. But that's not to say that in the time when you do, that you don't need support. And so that's where that professional learning comes in. So in my view, we need to graduate teachers who are good general educators who are prepared to teach every student in their class. But then when they have a student with very particular needs, that's when they get targeted professional support.
Thank you, Rhonda. We've got a question from the audience, our last question for today. So if I could hand over to Johana for that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja. So we had a pre-submitted question from the audience from Ji Zhang. I don't know if he's present right now, but so I will read it. Since the inclusion process is mutual, what are some strategies to involve educators, other students, and parents in the inclusion education? Anybody on the panel who would like to? What strategies can we use to involve educators, students, and parents in the inclusive education? Ignacio? You want to? Yeah.
Sí.
In the program to advocate inclusive education in the Americas, these American States organizations, one of the proposals is that inside the schools, among schools, and even beyond schools, to learn to think how to build inclusion, finding meeting spaces between members of a community, among members of different educational communities, and also beyond educational communities. I specifically remember a meeting with with 400 or perhaps 500 teachers. They were working in interactive panels, and in each of the tables, in which there were approximately 10 teachers, there were at least one representative of a family. Their guideline that was given to them is first, families speak up, and professionals have the obligation to carefully listen to the family. From that point on, then a debate was generated. The debate was on actual issues, real issues. This is a good way of doing continuing ed and training, and linked to the problems that we stumble upon as professionals on a daily basis in order to have an inclusive school. I remember a father at the end of the session, one of the fathers that was there said, "I thought that I was coming here to be told what to do." And I realized that that's not the case, that actually I am the one who has to say what to do. I'm the one who decides. So to be in that role of protagonist of the story, not subject of the story, I believe that's strictly related to this question. And following up on initial training, formation, I believe one of the main problems that has already been discussed here is that this initial training doesn't seem to resolve the real problems that the teachers go through once they step inside their classroom. And they understand that what before was just a label. Once they are in the classroom, they know this is a difficulty and they don't know how to manage, how to handle it. We will have to study how to do this. Is something that we are doing in my university this past week. How can we propose training based on practice, but also keeping in mind the paradox that the practices are not inclusive? How can we, from the practice, from reality, how can we solve things that are not part of the practice? And to a great extent, we see this possible in building investigative, interactive processes with university teachers and the educational community specifically. So we need to start thinking together, how can we make these classrooms inclusive?
Can I just say, one of the things that worked with medical professionals was parents going along to talk to trainee doctors about what living with a child with Down syndrome meant, and focusing on the child and the issues that Down syndrome brings along with it. That is one of the things that we've found also works in education, because the parents of other children are actually wanting to know what Down syndrome is. And now, these days, they can go and Google it, but they actually want to hear from the parents what the concerns are, what their problems are. And as soon as you open up to them, they are very much on side and will support. And this is where I was saying, they become your advocates as well. And I've seen very recently a little kindergarten in Fingal in New South Wales where, the child was basically being told that, it's one teacher to 25 kids. They're not ever going to cope with this little child with Down syndrome who runs away. But it was easily solved because parents were then willing to come along for a session during the day to actually make sure that this kid didn't run out the gate. There were no behavioural issues, but the kid happened to be a runaway kid. So, all you've got to do is explain to other people and you will get them on side, you will get them supporting you, much the way we got doctors actually now knowing what Down syndrome is, even though they were trained medical professionals. We now have the same happening with teachers. So, as advocates, that is what our role as parents is, that we have to actually go out and actually educate the world because it's taken a long time to do it. So, as I said, don't give up.
Yes, Dania?
Eu acho que é tudo que foi dito.
I believe that everything that was said was very important. I also think that students with both with and without disabilities, they need to participate in these conversations so that we can know what their desires and difficulties are. The issue of education, as you change education, it ceases to be education just for people without disabilities, and it becomes an inclusive education. Rodrigo mentioned that it's extremely important for us to change basic education in the universities that are training teachers. And we need to have specializations for teachers who do not have that knowledge so that they know that the school that they are working in is no longer the school from the past, but it must be a school for all. And people with Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities, they also need to know, to be more aware so that they can be empowered by society, so that they can also demand what they need and talk about what they are suffering at schools, so that those people can speak for themselves.
Is really critical to this question, to bringing stakeholders together, is again the shared understanding amongst all the stakeholder groups of what we're actually trying to do. So what is inclusive education? I think we need to acknowledge that what one person thinks inclusive education isn't necessarily the next person. I think through, for various reasons, like, the use of the word to rebrand segregated forms, or, integration being sort of dressed up as inclusion, we have people that aren't necessarily working to the same end. They're all sort of roughly agreeing, yes, we agree with inclusion, we support it, but don't actually really have a shared understanding. I think in order for us to go forward and unpack what are the concerns for each of those stakeholder groups and how we can address them, how we can support teachers or students with disabilities, or students who don't have disabilities, or school principals, policymakers, I think we do need to first start with the shared understanding, because what we do have is, a parent, recognising that a child sitting in by themselves with an assistant in the classroom to the side isn't inclusion, but many teachers actually think that's quite appropriate. So I think we really need to start with the shared understanding of what we're trying to do, and only from them can we actually really resolve the concerns, the issues, and find the solutions, because otherwise we're going to continue to be at cross purposes, and we'll end up just with the patchy situation that we have, which is just little pockets of people doing the right thing, or schools being beacon schools. But as for a systemic standard and expectation that when a parent arrives at a school to enrol their child, they're going to get a certain level of practice, that just isn't there. So I think to really address this at a systemic level, we have to really start with clarity of purpose and lighting the way forward.
Thank you very much. That was a really great statement for the conclusion, and I think we're time-wise at the end now, and need to create a clear vision and cooperate and listen to each other and work together. And thank you very much, and we're going to be concluding this session. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here and contributing to the conversation. Thank you.